All right, buckle up, everyone, because today we are diving deep into a world that's, well, it's a little bit wild.
Yeah, you could say that.
We're talking Chris Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation, SI for short. And let me tell you, we've got a mountain of sources to get through.
We do. Forum posts, news articles, even some pretty heated social media discussions.
So consider us your Sherpas, I guess. We're here to guide you through all of it.
We're going to help you sort through, all the information out there and try to figure out what's fact, what's opinion, and what it all means for understanding Chris Butler and Seth.
Exactly. So let's start with the basics. Who is this Chris Butler? I know he's the head of Ceph, which has roots in Gaudiya Vaishnavism.
Right. But there's a lot more to it than that. He wasn't always Chris Butler. Not that name anyway.
Oh, tell me more.
So he was born Chris Butler, obviously, but he's gone by a few different names since then. Took on the spiritual name Siddhaswarupananda for a while.
Wow, quite a mouthful.
And these days, he just goes by Chris Butler. But even more interesting than the name changes is, his father, a doctor, apparently called him a narcissistic psychopath.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty heavy statement, especially coming from his own father.
Right. It definitely makes you think about, like, what was going on in that family.
For sure. So how did he go from, Chris to spiritual leader?
Well, that's where SIF comes in. Butler founded it as an offshoot of IceKCon, but with a bigger emphasis on meditation, yoga, and this idea of finding your true identity.
On the surface, it all sounds pretty peaceful.
Yeah, very much aligned with traditional Gaudiya Vaishnavism. But as you dig deeper, you start to see, the controversies.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of them.
Oh, I've heard about that. What kind of accusations are we talking about here?
Pretty much everything. Cult-like practices, exploitation, financial impropriety, you name it.
Really? That's a far cry from peace and self-discovery.
Right. It's pretty wild.
So, what kind of evidence is there to support these claims? I mean, these are some pretty serious accusations.
Let's start with something light.
Okay.
So there's this story, and it's almost comical, about Butler throwing air purifiers off a plane.
What? Why would he do that?
Apparently there wasn't enough space.
Fair enough. I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, except, later on he complained about the air quality on the flight.
He threw the air purifiers off the plane and then complained about the air quality. Seriously.
Yep. And this is just one small example, but it kind of highlights this pattern of hypocrisy that some ex-members have talked about.
I see. It makes you wonder, how often his actions didn't quite match up with what Ceph was preaching.
Right. It's like, do as I say, not as I do, which isn't a great look for a spiritual leader.
Not at all. What about the financial accusations? Those are pretty serious, too.
Definitely. Some former members claim that Butler pressured them into making these huge donations, even going so far as to threaten to stop eating if they didn't meet his demands.
Whoa, hold on. Using food as leverage. That's pretty messed up.
It is. And it gets even shadier. After they sold some SUF properties in Poland, a big chunk of the money just disappeared. Poof. No explanation, no accountability.
Vanished. Seriously.
Seriously. And then on top of that, there are accusations that they were profiting off the labor of their own members, under the guise of voluntary service.
So it wasn't actually voluntary?
Not according to some former members. And it gets even more bizarre. People going to work for SUF in Hawaii were made to sign non-disclosure agreements, NDAs.
NDAs. For working at a spiritual organization.
Yep, and these weren't just your standard NDAs. They came with some hefty financial penalties if you broke them.
Wow. That's not normal at all. What were they so afraid of people talking about?
Good question. It definitely gives the impression that they were trying to silence any potential criticism.
It sounds like a culture of secrecy and control, which doesn't exactly scream spiritual enlightenment.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder if the focus was really on spiritual growth or financial gain.
Right? It seems like maybe SUF wasn't practicing what they were preaching.
That's a question that we're going to keep exploring as we go deeper. The discrepancies between what they said and what actually happened, they're definitely worth investigating.
Okay, so let's talk about those contradictions. What are some examples of SIF's teachings clashing with their actions?
Well, we've already touched on the whole financial pressure thing, which kind of goes against the whole Gaudiya Vaishnava principle of Nishkama karma, selfless action, without expecting anything in return, right?
It's a pretty big contradiction.
And then there's the way they use das and dasi.
The terms for male and female devotees.
Yeah. In traditional Gaudiya Vaishnavism, those terms have distinct roles attached to them, but in SIF, they're used interchangeably.
So another deviation from traditional practice. It seems like Sif was picking and choosing what parts of Gaudiya Vaishnavism to follow, maybe to fit their own agenda.
It's definitely a possibility.
Uh,
And then there are the accounts that are, well, a little bit more disturbing, like the allegations of followers drinking the water used to wash Butler's feet.
Wait, seriously?
It's been presented as a form of devotion. But, I mean, it raises concerns about manipulation.
That's taking devotion to a whole new level. I mean,
Yeah.
where do you draw the line between reverence and just blind obedience?
It's a slippery slope, for sure. And it's something we'll be keeping a close eye on as we delve deeper.
You know, it's interesting because for someone who preaches peace and self-discovery, Butler seems to have a pretty strong interest in politics. Didn't he get involved in some political party back in the 70s?
He did. It was called the Independence for Godly Government Party. Didn't last long, but it shows that he's always been interested in power, even outside the spiritual realm.
That's a good point. And speaking of political influence, we can't ignore the connection to Tulsi Gabbard.
Right, the former U.S. representative.
Yeah, she's a known follower of Sif.
And she's faced some pretty serious accusations of being, well, basically a puppet for Butler and the organization.
That's a pretty strong claim.
It is. But on the other hand, the Hindu American Foundation has come to their defense, saying the whole thing is just, Hindu-phobic bias in the media.
So it's not just about a spiritual leader and his organization. We're talking about religious freedom, representation, and potentially a whole lot more.
Exactly. It's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. It's this whole intersection of spiritual influence, political power, and religious freedom.
A lot to unpack for sure. But before we get into all of that, I want to hear from the people who've actually been a part of SEF, the former members.
Their stories are essential. They give us that inside perspective that helps us understand the accusations and ultimately get closer to the truth.
So let's dive into those firsthand accounts in the next part of our deep dive. Okay, so we've heard about the controversies and the accusations. Now, let's hear from the people who were actually there, the former SEF members. Their experiences are, well, they're crucial to understanding what was really going on.
Absolutely. And one story that really stands out is that of Madhai Das. He was a dedicated member of SIF until he decided to join another Gaudiya Vaishnava group.
So he was still following the same spiritual tradition, just a different group within that tradition.
Right. But according to Madhai Das, when he left SEF, he was shunned by the community.
Seriously, they shunned him just for choosing a different path within the same tradition.
That's what he says. And his story isn't unique. There are other former members who have reported similar treatment after leaving.
So it wasn't enough to just leave. You had
Oh.
to stay within their sphere of influence or face the consequences.
It makes you think about, how much control they really had over people's lives.
Yeah, it's a level of control that seems to go beyond just spiritual guidance. What does Seth have to say about these allegations of shunning?
Not much, actually. They haven't really addressed it publicly.
That's interesting. It's almost like that do as I say, not as I do thing we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
They preach peace and understanding, but then they turn around and shun people who don't follow their exact path.
It's a pattern that's worth noting. Remember, we're just trying to piece together the full picture here.
Right. So where does Tulsi Gabbard fit into all of this? Her political career is public knowledge, but her connection to SUF is, well, it's a little bit more mysterious.
It is, and it's definitely a key piece of the puzzle. Gabbard has always been a strong advocate for peace and nonviolence, which, aligns with SIF's teachings.
Sure, that makes sense.
But some people argue that her stance isn't just personal conviction. They think she's basically a mouthpiece for Butler and SIF.
That's a pretty serious accusation.
It is, but there's some interesting evidence to support it. For example, when they analyzed Gabbard's campaign donations, they found a lot of contributions from members of a group called the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh.
I'm not familiar with that.
It's a Hindu nationalist organization based in India, and their ideology is, well, let's just say it doesn't exactly scream peace and nonviolence.
So you've got this group that's known for Hindu nationalism, donating to a politician who's connected to this seemingly peaceful spiritual organization.
It's a little strange, right? It makes you wonder about the connections and motivations behind it all.
It's like every time we think we've got a handle on things, something else pops up that just throws everything off.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to hear from the former members. They can provide context and help us understand the accusations.
Okay, so tell me, what are some specific things that former members have said about their experiences in Ceres?
One thing that comes up a lot is the environment of control. Like, they controlled pretty much every aspect of your life.
I mean, we've already talked about the NDAs and the accusations of exploited labor.
Right, but it goes even deeper than that. Some former members have said that Butler actually discouraged them from pursuing higher education.
Well, why would he do that?
Some people believe it was a way to keep them dependent on Seth for knowledge and guidance, limit outside influence.
Control the information, control the people.
Exactly. And there are also stories of intense scrutiny and judgment within the community.
Wait, really? I thought we were talking about a spiritual group here. Shouldn't it be all about acceptance and compassion?
You'd think so, but former members describe this culture where, like, every little thing you did, even what you thought, was monitored and judged.
Wow. That sounds incredibly oppressive. Not exactly the image of self-discovery and freedom that they project to the outside world.
Right. It makes you question what it was really like to be a part of that community.
It's like we're putting together this puzzle, but there are all these missing pieces. The contradictions, the secrecy, the control. It's a lot to process.
And just when you think you've seen it all, there's another twist. Remember those financial irregularities we talked about?
Missing money, the pressure for donations, all that.
Well, it turns out that Butler was living this lavish lifestyle. Expensive home, luxury cars, the whole 9 yards.
Hold on. Didn't he threaten to stop eating to get more donations?
Yeah.
That doesn't sound very lavish.
It doesn't, does it? But multiple sources, ex-members, and online discussions, they all detail his extravagant lifestyle. It's a bit of a head-scratcher.
So he's living the high life while his followers are struggling to make ends meet. That just doesn't sit right.
It raises a lot of questions about where the money was going and what SIF's priorities really were.
It's starting to feel like less of a spiritual organization and more like a business venture with some questionable ethics.
That's a harsh assessment. And it's one that a lot of former members have made. And when you look at the evidence, the financial stuff, the sale of the properties, the missing funds, it's hard to ignore.
And then there's that whole thing with QNet.
Ah, yes. QNet.
The multi-level marketing company.
The one and only. Several SIF members have been linked to it, which has led to some speculation about whether the organization was involved in this whole marketing scheme.
A spiritual organization promoting a multi-level marketing company. That's pretty wild.
It's definitely raised some eyebrows. And it adds another layer to this question of, were they really focused on spiritual growth, or was it all about the money?
Every layer we peel back, it's like we find another contradiction, another questionable practice.
And that's why it's so important to be critical when we're looking at information about any organization, especially a spiritual one.
Right. Question everything.
Exactly. Don't just take things at face value. Look deeper. Consider all the angles.
So where do we go from here? I mean, we've covered Butler's history, the accusations against Seth, the experiences of ex-members. What does it all mean?
Well, that's what we're going to try to figure out in the final part of our deep dive. We'll connect the dots, look at the evidence, and hopefully leave you with some food for thought.
Sounds good to me. We've uncovered a lot of information, but the real work starts now, trying to make sense of it all. Welcome back to the show, everyone. It feels like we've gone down the rabbit hole with this Chris Butler and Seth deep dive.
We have. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, so much information, so many twists and turns. What's the big takeaway here? What are we supposed to make of all this?
Well, for me, it's the interplay between spirituality, power, and influence. These are dynamics that we see in a lot of organizations, but rarely do we get to examine them in such detail like we have here.
It really makes you think about the human need for connection, for purpose, for answers, and how that can make people vulnerable to manipulation.
Exactly. History is full of these charismatic leaders who draw people in, and sometimes it leads to good things, sometimes not. The key is learning to discern between genuine spiritual guidance and harmful control.
So what are some of the red flags we should be looking out for?
A big one is lack of transparency, especially when it comes to finances. We saw that with SIF. The missing money, the pressure for donations, the potential link to QNet. All those are signs that something might not be right.
It seems like there's this pattern of contradictions between what SIF claimed to be and what former members experienced. The financial irregularities, the control tactics, the shunning. It's like their actions didn't match their words.
And that's a big problem. True spirituality should empower people, encourage critical thinking, not foster dependence or silence dissent.
So it really comes down to trust. Trusting your gut, trusting the evidence, and not just blindly following someone, no matter how charismatic they might seem.
Absolutely. Now, going back to Tulsi Gabbard for a minute, we've talked about her loyalty to Sif and the accusations of undue influence. Where do you think her allegiances lie?
It's hard to say definitively. She denies any manipulation from Butler or Sif and says her commitment to Gaudiya Vaishnavism is her own. But those campaign donations from the RSS, they raise questions.
For sure. It's hard to square those donations with her stance on peace and nonviolence. I mean, maybe she just accepts donations from anyone who supports her policies, regardless of their affiliations. But who knows?
So we're left with more questions than answers.
That's often the case with critical thinking. We weigh the evidence, consider different perspectives, and try to come to our own conclusions.
And that's okay. It's about taking responsibility for our own beliefs, not letting anyone else tell us what to think or feel.
Exactly. It's about questioning everything and being willing to challenge the status quo, especially when it comes to organizations that claim to have all the answers.
What a great message to leave our listeners with. As we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you hope people take away from our conversation?
I'd say discernment. It's like a superpower in this day and age. With all the information overload, we need to approach everything with a healthy dose of skepticism. Question motives, examine the evidence, dig a little deeper.
Discernment. It's like a muscle. You got to keep it flexed.
Exactly. It can protect us from manipulation and the allure of those easy answers that might not be so easy after all.
Well said. To all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep that critical thinking muscle working.
The deep dive never really ends. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of Chris Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation.